I think it's time to present our second speaker today. It's Szymon Korzeniowski, head of mobile at Recruitee. He's a fan of cross-platform solutions, especially the ones based on web technologies. His adventure with Ionic started with version 1 alpha, so that's pretty long time ago. Huh? He will cover the topic why I love Capacitor, and you will too. Please welcome Szymon Korzeniowski.
Okay, hello everyone. Let me just set this thing up. And yeah, that's it. Okay, works. All right, so yeah, my name is Szymon, and I work at Recruitee. We are a platform that enables companies of all kinds to manage the recruitment and hiring process. And I'm currently working on a brand new version of our mobile app, which has always been based since the very first version on Ionic and Angular. Our main web app is also an Angular-based web app. But with this new version, we've decided to take a bit of a bigger step and actually rewrite it from Ionic 3 and Cordova, which the current version is using, to Ionic 4 and also Capacitor. And as you may see from the picture right here, I can get excited about different kinds of stuff quite easily. That's me getting excited about Mount Fuji, by the way. Not that easy to see it normally. Yeah, to tell the truth, I got quite excited about Capacitor. The more I actually got to use it, the more I got to research its features. And I hope I can get you all a bit excited about it as well. So maybe first a very quick show of hands. Who here has used Capacitor already? Okay, and how many of you have heard or know what Capacitor is in general? Okay, and how many of you have either heard or used about Cordova? Okay, so just to get you very, very quickly up to speed, Cordova has traditionally been the layer of abstraction over basically the bridge between the JS side of things and the native side of things in Ionic and basically all major hybrid apps that are based on web views. So it falls into this JS native bridge on that diagram that Marta showed you on the previous presentation. And Capacitor is basically the same thing. It fits in the same place, but the Ionic team, having a couple of years of experience of using Cordova in Ionic, they thought that, hey, maybe we can write a better thing from scratch and make it better suit our needs. And yeah, that's what they call it. They call it a spiritual successor to Cordova that uses modern native tools. So yeah, first of all, it supports iOS, Android, and also Electron, and what is probably the most important for progressive web app developers, it also supports the web. And similar to Cordova, it provides a CLI, although it's locally installed, not a global one. It is created and maintained by the Ionic team. It was first announced almost 2 years ago now in December 2017. It was first codenamed Avocado, and they changed the name after that. And the first stable version was released in May 2019. So yeah, that's Capacitor in a nutshell. And now on to the reasons why I think Capacitor is really great technology. Okay, so first of all, Capacitor has a lot of great built-in APIs. Traditionally with Cordova, to use any kind of native functionality, you had to actually reach out and download a respective plugin. And with Capacitor, a lot of those features, at least those most popular and most common, are available through built-in APIs. So they're basically included in the core Capacitor package, which is actually 3 packages, like core iOS and Android for each platform. But all of these are baked in, so you don't have to download external plugins. You just use the available APIs. So this has a few upsides. First of all, if you have any kind of rapid development cycle with Cordova, when you, for example, wanted to introduce a new native feature to your app, you basically had to push a new binary and make the users download it from the app stores. And with Capacitor, all of this is included. So if, say, you want to include something from this list in your app, you can just code push it if you're using Ionic Appflow or any other technology that just pushes the web view side of things to clients. And this, you might ask, why is this needed? There's already Ionic Native, which has even more functions, even more plugins. Well, the truth is it isn't really a built-in feature like in Capacitor. It's basically just a set of wrappers over all kinds of third-party Cordova plugins. So this includes some that are written and maintained by the Cordova team, but a lot of them, I'd say the majority of them, is either written by some regular people like us who either do it in their free time or do it as part of some corporate project. And the lifespan of such plugins, as with lots of open source projects, can be pretty unpredictable. And actually, Ionic, by introducing this additional layer, this Ionic native kind of pack of wrappers over those libraries, it introduced another layer of another layer where things can potentially go wrong, because platforms move fast. Native platforms, iOS, Android, they get updates very quickly. They get new versions released each year with lots of new features, with lots of API changes. And in addition to the Ionic native, in addition to the Cordova plugin having to follow the new and updated features of the native APIs, we also have this Ionic native plugin or wrapper that needs to follow the release schedule of the underlying plugin, which is a hard dependency, basically. And we've actually had already quite a few cases where we had to ditch completely the Ionic native plugin because it simply didn't work for us, because something changed, or there was some API in the Cordova plugin that we needed, some feature that just wasn't available or didn't work correctly in the Ionic native plugin. So yeah, there's a lot of them, but I wouldn't say they will be the most reliable, in especially going forward. And also, yeah, there is a two-step installation or upgrade every time you add a plugin. So first you do an npm install on the Ionic native library, and then you have to do the Cordova plugin add. And this all adds to the whole bunch of administrative tasks that you have to remember to do every time you change. So that was a bit about the built-in features, but that doesn't mean that with Ionic, with Capacitor, you cannot use plugins. Quite the contrary, actually. In addition to the built-in APIs that you just saw, Capacitor has support for external community plugins, and you can actually find a lot of them on their website. It's basically a list that they maintain of all the additional third-party plugins for Capacitor. And what's most important, it embraces NPM and only NPM for plugin distribution. So you just install this plugin once and then just run the Capacitor sync command that basically does everything for you. You don't have to remember to update every corresponding native side of the plugin. It's kind of, if you've ever used React Native, it's kind of similar to what React Native Link does, I believe. And Additionally, creating new plugins is much easier if you need to add some custom functionality. If you have an idea for a plugin that you want to get out to the world with it, the Capacitor CLI actually has this built-in scaffolding, this generator where you just run plugin generate and you have all those options, and it prepares a fresh plugin scaffoldings that you can build on. And most importantly, at least for all the people who have already invested their time and money in Cordova-based apps, so basically all the Ionic apps that use lots of different Cordova plugins, including those not very common ones, Capacitor is compatible with a lot of Cordova plugins. They include this compatibility layer. It's not compatible with all of them. They do maintain a list of incompatible plugins, but to be fair, a lot of them are actually functionalities that either are covered by the built-in APIs of Capacitor, so you simply don't really need to use that respective Cordova plugin anymore. Or, for example, you can just use the platform because the web APIs have evolved quite a bit, and I'll show you a few examples in a short case study in a moment of those cases. And another great feature that Cordova simply did not have is that Capacitor fully embraces PWA and all kinds of web apps. So in addition to supporting iOS and Android and also Electron, all the built-in APIs of Capacitor also provides implementations for the web, of course, wherever it is relevant. If there is some plugin that doesn't really make sense because you're not able to do such thing on the web, well, then it does not have this web implementation. But if you, for example, want to develop a test suite, some end-to-end test suite where you just want to write one code and test iOS, Android, and the web with it, and you assume that, okay, well, we'll just mock this functionality so that we get the tests to pass, you can totally do that. There is a nice article on the Ionic blog on how you can create a mock web implementation of a plugin with just a few lines of code for that. And finally, there are some cases where, well, you need some additional visual layer on top of the available web APIs to properly mimic the native functionality. So the most obvious case is the camera, because yeah, of course you can use the video HTML elements to show the live feed, but you don't have all those UI elements that are normally associated with the native camera views. So Capacitor actually has this package called PWA Elements, which currently only features camera and toast, but those are actually based on web components, and they provide a very minimal layer of UI that you can basically out of the box create an app that will work on iOS, Android, and the web, and you'll be able to take pictures with a UI that looks consistent, and you don't actually have to worry about writing any of this code yourself. And finally, Capacitor fully embraces the native side of things. With Cordova, this was actually a bit of a mix. First of all, tell me, has this ever happened to... No, sorry, that's the wrong picture. Has this ever happened to you? Anyone got this error ever? If not, I'll explain. With Cordova, you have a lot of things that are kind of automatically generated based on the config XML file. So most recently this year, Apple has introduced this requirement to describe the purpose of the usage of certain APIs. And for example, camera and geolocation and stuff like that. And the worst thing about that is you actually build your app, it passes without any errors. You package it up, you send it to the App Store, and it doesn't show any problems. And only then, after like a couple of days or a week, you get back this, that, sorry, we can't accept your app because you didn't include a purpose string. And we've actually had a case in our app that we had a separate file checked into the repository with like important things to check to make sure that those things are there, that they didn't get destroyed with Cordova rebuilding the project files. And yeah, the most important change in Capacitor is that it doesn't treat your native code as a build artifact. It actually is treated as a source asset. So you actually, oh, sorry, that skipped a bit. So yeah, what they call it is not write once, run everywhere, but code once, configure everywhere. So all the native code is actually part of your source code, and you have all of it checked into source control, and you are in full control of all the config files. So all the plist files for iOS, all the XML config files for Android. And there are no configuration abstraction like the config XML and all kinds of plugin variables that basically all kinds of things are thrown into Cordova's config XML files. And not all plugins provide you with plugin variables. Like when this Apple thing came up, a few plugins just didn't catch up and you weren't able to set those strings anywhere in the Cordova config, and you actually had to remember and write them manually. So not a great situation. With Capacitor, you have all of that checked in. So if you make any changes, it stays there. It will always be there. It won't get wiped away and recreated with each build you make. And finally, you don't really need to write a plugin to add any kind of custom native code because of Cordova's behavior. So basically wiping everything and regenerating everything. There was no good way to kind of add some tiny bit of native code that you needed to change how your app behaves on the native side of things. You basically either had to redo it or have some Git patches or some other crazy things that weren't really great developer experience. And now you can just simply add a few lines to your native code, to your Android, iOS code, and yeah, just not have to worry that it will disappear in any way. And one thing that might be a bit controversial for some, because it introduces a bit of a learning curve if you were relying on Cordova previously and the CLI doing everything for you, is that Capacitor actually does not rely on the CLI for things like building the native packages. So you're actually being told to use Xcode and Android Studio for all of that. And on one hand, yeah, it's a bit of a bother if you like never really wanted to touch it, but it's actually, in the long run, in my opinion, it's a great thing because you can, if something goes wrong, for example, during the build phase, and you want to look for any kind of assistance, you look for, you ask questions on the internet, or you look for answers on Stack Overflow or anything, there is a big chance that someone had this problem writing a native, like a full native application, and this may basically be the same error because it's caused by the native side of things. So you might be actually able to find the answer to that quicker than in this very specific abstracted away world of Cordova and its configs. And in addition, it also uses the native repositories like CocoaPods for iOS and Gradle and Maven for the dependency management on the native side of things. Oh yeah, and by the way, this other message that you see here, deprecated API usage, is something that you'll be seeing much more often if you're developing Cordova apps. Because that first there was just a notice, now they changed it to a more serious warning, and there is no given deadline for that. They're not saying when they will stop accepting those apps. But UI WebView, which is the traditional WebView that was used by Cordova and was only for iOS and was only replaced by WK WebView in the recent years, will not be supported. And even if you actually use even if you don't actually use UI WebView, but just WK WebView in your Cordova app, it still has the references to UI WebView that cannot be easily removed. And there is an open ticket in the Cordova GitHub repo, and they still haven't figured out a solution to that. And whereas Capacitor actually made an update recently that they just got rid of any UI WebView references. So you won't be getting those errors with Capacitor at all. And you actually can find a blog post on the Ionic blog regarding that if you need more info. Okay, so to the final part of my presentation, I wanted to show you a short case study of how we went from 15 Cordova plugins in our current version of the Recruitee mobile app to 0. And actually, in the original description, there was 1, but since then we figured out that that wasn't needed, and we went down to 0 plugins in a quite large production app. So going one by one. First of all, the one that's most common, Cordova plugin splash screen, replaced with the Ionic, with the Capacitor built-in splash screen API, has all the same functionality. Same goes for status bar. When you need to change the color or the appearance of the status bar, the Capacitor API gave us the same functionality that we had from the Cordova plugin. Device is a plugin in case of Cordova where you get information like the platform that you're running on or some other system info if you need that. And Capacitor does exactly the same thing with its device API. In addition, we were actually using a plugin called app version to get the binary version number of the version number of the actual binary app, the build, that's running on the device, to prompt to tell the user that there is a new version, that there are some new features that they probably should update, or even in some rare cases just force them to update and not allow them to proceed. And actually it turned out that in Capacitor this is also part of the device API. It's not even a separate API, but it's the app version is actually returned when you ask the device API for info. Probably the most, sorry, it's a bit slow. Probably the most common one is camera, and yeah, as you could see, implementing this for iOS, Android, and the web. Because yeah, one important thing that I think I didn't mention, with the new version of the app, we're not only targeting iOS and Android, but we will also be releasing it as a PWA and basically the default mobile experience that our customers will be seeing when they go to when they log into our web app. So yeah, so camera is a great example. Basically nothing we had to do, no crazy workarounds for web as well. Next is clipboard. That's pretty straightforward. Once again, we have a simple API and Capacitor that handles all of that. Let me just speed it up because it takes a while for the points to actually appear on. Okay. Right. File and file path were two different plugins. One of them when we actually wanted to save a file to the native file system, and file path if we wanted to find the actual native path of a file. And once again, those two basically, all of those functionalities are in one single Capacitor API, which is called file system. Keyboard, well, probably one of the most popular plugins as well, where you could control showing and hiding of the keyboard. That's also handled by the keyboard API. Push notifications, that's also quite good news, because that was a rather big and complicated plugin, and Capacitor also managed to squeeze this in as a built-in API. And now for the last 5. Okay, and one more. Okay, so deep links. Deep links, as you may know, are any kinds of links that point the user directly to our app, to some specific point in the app. And for that, we've used Cordova plugin custom URL scheme originally. And actually, this was a case where I thought, hey, there is no built-in API for deep links. And then I took a closer look at the documentation. I was actually hidden inside the app API. You have this method called get launch URL or something like that, that basically just gives you what URL the app was originally launched with, so you can redirect the user to a specific point in the app. And that's, of course, also commonly used in any kind of OAuth authentication scenarios where the web view or any kind of external authentication client redirects you to a specific URL, which in this case is an in-app URL. And also related to the authentication flow and a couple of other things in our app is the in-app browser. And also, traditionally, there was the in-app browser plugin, but since a couple years ago, I think already, it's not the recommended way to run any kind of embedded web content in your app. You can't even, in terms of authentication, Google even blocks it, so you can't do a Google OAuth, for example, if you're using an in-app browser. So the Cordova plugin in-app browser does not have a Capacitor equivalent, because it's simply outdated and you most likely won't need it, only if you need to support iOS less than 9 or Android less than 5. Otherwise, they support those new APIs for iOS. It's called this Safari View Controller, and for Android, it's Chrome Custom Tabs. And actually, the name of this plugin was very confusing, because it supplied both iOS and Android using those two respective APIs underneath. Now the API is just simply called browser, and in addition it supports the web. So if you want to, you just do one line of code to open an in-app browser on the device, or to just redirect the user to a particular URL on the web. And the final two, transfer was an interesting example, because the original app was written a couple years ago when it was quite difficult to download or upload binary files in a sane way using just web APIs. So there was this plugin called Cordova plugin file transfer that helped you achieve that in hybrid apps. But since then, the XHR2 spec came to be, and you simply don't need the platform once again if you're using iOS 10 or up, or Android 4.4 or up. You can just safely use the platform. It's a quite popular term, right? And the very last one, this was the one that actually we thought we need a Capacitor plugin for, was SMS. And in the end, it also turned out that we just can use the platform for that, because a simple Ahref SMS can both send you to the native messaging app with the proper telephone number, and it can even pre-fill the contents if you supply them in this attribute. So yeah, that's basically all from my side. I really hope I got you all a bit excited about Capacitor, and I hope you use it or continue to use it in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Szymon. Maybe do you have, guys, any question to Szymon? Or he explained a lot, or everything around Capacitor? Yeah?
Was there any improvement in performance comparing Capacitor to Cordova, or should we still expect pretty much the same, but less overhead?
Well, I would say I didn't really notice, like from the user perspective, I don't think there is a lot of difference, because most of the time underneath those Capacitor APIs do the same thing as the Cordova plugins, and basically a lot of that overhead that you have with Cordova is up until the build and package point where the developer experience is a bit more involved, and you need to do more stuff and have to handle more code. But yeah, in the end, I would say, yeah, performance-wise for the user, I don't think there's any change.
Thanks.
One more.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Go on.
No, I remember when I was using Cordova, we had a lot of annoying situations when playing with keyboard and inputs and views jumping around, or the change of the size of the viewport not being correctly recognized. Did that improve by any chance?
I would say not that much. I think maybe there's not a lot of cases where we had to deal with like crazy things, but I would say we've faced a few similar issues with the Capacitor keyboard plugin. I guess they pretty much followed, since the original plugin for the keyboard was also like written by the Ionic team, so I think they kind of followed it closely in terms of the native code. And I think there's still quite a few issues posted there that they are not easily able to solve from what I know, unfortunately.
Okay. Thanks again, Szymon. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks a lot.